This is Kol Birama, the podcast of Congregation Ramat Raz 929 Tanakh Project. Join us each day as we study a chapter of Tanakh, building towards completing all 929 together. I'm Rabbi Yoni Zolti, and I'm glad you're here. Shemot Chapter 6. Chapter 6 presents us with an exegetical puzzle that has perplexed readers for millennia. After Paro rejects Moshe's request to free Bnei Israel and instead adds to their troubles, Moshe complains to God. God's response is rather puzzling. He appears to repeat the vision that Moshe has already received in chapter 3. Moshe has already encountered the divine at the burning bush in chapter 3, receiving an elaborate commission to liberate Bnei Israel from Egyptian bondage. In that vision, God promised to remember the patriarchs, to redeem the people from their affliction, and to bring them to the land flowing with milk and honey. The divine message seemed complete, the mission clearly articulated. Why then does chapter 6 appear to retrace this same theological ground? What necessity compels this apparent recapitulation of divine promises already pronounced? This textual redundancy has long troubled biblical scholars. Source critics have identified these repetitions as evidence of documentary stratification. The earlier chapters attributed to the E source, the Elohistic source, while chapter 6 in their mind belongs to the J or the Yahwistic tradition. The contradictions appear particularly acute when God declares, Va'era el Avraham el Yitzchak ve'el Yaakov be'el Shaddai u'shmi Hashem lo nodati lahem. I appeared to Avraham, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov as El Shaddai, but my name, Hashem, I did not make myself known to them. Yet in Bereshit, the patriarchs several times invoke Hashem's name, the tetragrammaton, seemingly contradicting this claim of novelty. While the question of divine nomenclature deserves sustained attention, I want to bracket that particular interpretive challenge for now and focus instead on what this repetition reveals about the theological architecture of redemption itself. For embedded within this apparent redundancy lies a profound truth about the dual foundations upon which Israel's liberation rests. Let me explain. When God first appears to Moshe at the burning bush, the divine self-presentation centers overwhelmingly on mercy and compassion for the afflicted. The text emphasizes, with deliberate repetition, God's awareness of Israel's suffering. Consider the accumulation of terminology. Ra'o ra'iti et oni ami, I have surely seen the affliction of my people. Ve'etzakatam shamati mipnei nogasav, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. Ki yadati et machovav, for I know their suffering. The root tza'ak, denoting the cry of anguish, appears multiple times across these chapters, establishing a thematic refrain. God responds to human suffering. This divine responsiveness operates as a universal principle. The cry of the oppressed elicits divine intervention regardless of particular identity or covenantal status. Indeed, while the patriarchs are mentioned, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, their invocation functions primarily to establish continuity rather than to reference any covenant. They represent the God who has consistently heard the cries of the afflicted throughout history, not necessarily the God bound by ancient treaty obligations. The emphasis falls squarely on the people's present suffering and God's compassionate response to that immediate anguish. Chapter 6, by contrast, introduces us to an entirely different theological framework. Here, God presents himself not primarily as the universal respondent to human suffering, but as the covenant keeper bound by ancient promises. The language shifts dramatically from the vocabulary of compassion to the terminology of legal obligation. The chapter opens with explicit covenantal language. Hakimoti et biriti itam latet lam et eretz Canaan. I have established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan. This invocation deliberately echoes the Brit Ben Haptarim, the covenant between the pieces, where God prophesies to Abraham both the Egyptian bondage and the eventual restoration to their ancestral land. The references thus to the patriarchs carry fundamentally different valence here than in chapter 3. Rather than merely identifying the God of history, they invoke specific contractual obligations. God is fulfilling particular promises made to particular ancestors regarding a particular territory. This is not the God who generically responds to oppression wherever it occurs, but the God who remembers Va'eskoret Beriti, and I have remembered my covenant. Correspondingly, the promised destination transforms in character. In chapter 3, the land is described as Eretz Levat Chalav Udvash, a land flowing with milk and honey, emphasizing its material bounty and desirability. Chapter 6, however, specifies Vinatati ota lachem morasha. I will give you the land as an inheritance. The terminology of inheritance signals ancestral entitlement rather than mere geographic relocation. This is not simply a better place to live, it is their land, promised to their forefathers, now being reclaimed through covenantal right. These divergent theological frameworks elicit strikingly different responses from Bnei Israel. In chapter 4, when Moshe first presents himself to them as God's emissary, the people respond with enthusiasm. Vaya'amen ha'am vayishme'u ki fakad Adonai et bnei Yisrael v'chi ra'a et onyam vayikdu vayishtachavu. And the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had taken notice of the Israelites and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed low in homage. The God who sees their present suffering and promises immediate relief proves compelling and attractive. In contrast, chapter 6 presents a far bleaker reception. When Moshe delivers God's covenantal message, we read that Bnei Israel lo shamu el Moshe mikotzer ruach u'me'avodah kasha. They did not listen to Moshe because of shortness of spirit and hard labor. The people reject his message not because they doubt its truth, but because they lack the spiritual and emotional capacity to engage with covenantal thinking under their present duress. This divergence illuminates something profound about human religious psychology. The God of universal compassion, the deity who responds to immediate suffering, appeals to our most basic human needs and proves accessible even in extremis. But the God of covenant, the deity bound by ancient promises to long dead ancestors, requires a form of sustained historical consciousness and spiritual bandwidth that brutal oppression renders nearly impossible to maintain. After all, who can possibly possess the energy required for genealogical reflection while being crushed underneath Paro's whip? This theological bifurcation extends to the very presentation of Moshe himself. The literary architecture of these chapters reinforces the distinction between universal moral actor and covenantal descendant through careful attention to biographical framing. In chapter 2, which establishes the foundation for Moshe's initial encounter with God, Moshe is presented primarily as a man of moral conscience operating on universal ethical principles. When he witnesses an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, he intervenes, not because of tribal loyalty, but because injustice demands response. Likewise, when he notices the daughters of Yitro being abused by the shepherds in Midian, he likewise intervenes. His parentage receives only cursory mention. Vayelech ish mi beit Levi vayikach et bat Levi. A man from the house of Levi went and took a daughter of Levi. The studied vagueness, a man, a woman, deliberately obscures Moshe's genealogical credentials. What matters is not his yichus, his lineage, but rather his moral character, his instinctive solidarity with the oppressed. In contrast, the revelation in chapter 6 is presented in dramatically different contexts. Chapter 6 interrupts its narrative to provide an elaborate genealogical interlude. Suddenly, we receive detailed lineages, the sons of Reuven, the sons of Shimon, and most extensively, the descendants of Levi traced through multiple generations. Text meticulously establishes Moshe and Aaron's descent. Ve'amram lakach et Yocheved dodato lo isha, v'ateded lo et Aaron ve'et Moshe. Amram took as a wife his aunt Yocheved, and she bore to him Aaron and Moshe. The genealogical precision here serves a deliberate theological purpose. When God operates as covenant keeper, leadership credentials derive from covenantal continuity. Moshe and Aaron, thus, must be shown to possess not only righteous character, but legitimate ancestral connection to those with whom the original covenant was forged. Their yichus becomes not incidental, but essential to their authority as covenant mediators. In sum, the apparent redundancy between chapters 3 through 4 versus chapter 6 resolves into complementary theological necessity. Israel's redemption rests simultaneously on two foundations. On the one hand, the universal principle of divine compassion for the oppressed, while on the other hand, the particular obligations of ancient covenant. Both frameworks prove indispensable. Were God to redeem Israel solely based on covenantal obligation, their redemption would lack a moral urgency, a mere fulfillment of contractual terms divorced from present suffering. Conversely, were God to redeem Israel solely based on universal compassion, then the redemption would lack a theological particularity. Israel would be simply another oppressed people among many, with no unique claim to divine attention or ancestral land. The genius of the book of Shemot lies in its refusal to choose between these two frameworks. Instead, it insists on their dialectical necessity. Israel is redeemed both because God hears the cry of the afflicted and because God remembers the covenant with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The God who responds to immediate suffering and the God who fulfills ancient promises are not different deities, but the same God operating through complementary modes of divine engagement with human history. This dual foundation will continue to structure Israel's relationship with the divine throughout the Torah, a tension between universal moral principles on the one hand and particular covenantal obligations on the other, which together enriches both dimensions and prevents either from collapsing into the other. Thank you for joining today's learning. See you tomorrow for the next chapter of Tanakh.